Ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege to be back here at the Kingston Conference on International Security. I was here, I think it was 2 years ago, speaking, and that time the subject was enhancing human performance. So that just shows the diversity of subjects that this important conference covers, so thank you for having me back. When asked to come here, I pretty much said, yeah, right on, I'm on it, especially when Daryl Cross was sending me a bunch of emails over in Korea and wanting me to commit right away. Couldn't turn them down. But also couldn't turn down the fact that I've got a good relationship with, or some form of personal relationship with each of the four co-hosts for this. I spent much of my career dealing with KCIS and some of the stuff they work on. I'm a proud graduate of the U.S. Army War College. I used to be the deputy for the current commandant of NATO Defense College. And my wife is a Queen's grad. In fact, we met in a bar about 150 meters that way. So I got some form of relationship with all four co-hosts. So the subject of this year's conference, a changing international order, is most appropriate from where I've been working. Chris mentioned hegemon this morning, so Korea is kind of in the shadow of one of the hegemons, to borrow a title from an Orson Scott Card book. You know, the regional dynamics being played out in that part of the world is fascinating on one hand, but very scary on the other. You know, it's certainly a volatile environment, and there's incredible risk for miscalculation. So it's been my incredible privilege to serve there as the first non-U.S. deputy commander, especially during this potentially historic but certainly tumultuous year, as we've seen lots of changes happen on the ground. It's been a very busy time since I assumed the role, and during this talk I'm going to get into what we've been doing, some of the challenges we face, and the larger geostrategic situation as it pertains to the command. And all of this will be from a practitioner's perspective. Now, I'll admit up front that I approach this with some trepidation, because although I've been fully immersed in the problem set there for the last 15, 16 months, the more I learn, the more I realize that I'm far from being an expert, and it's really like peeling the onion, and you always want to cry when you learn more. So first of all, why Canada? You know, I need to address up front why this matters to us. You know, I've been asked many times why Canada would pony up a 3-star for this position on the other side of the world. So when selected for this job, I did my own mission analysis and really focused on 3 strategic goals that have formed the framework of my continuing assessment. Now, first is the operation itself. Now, we have a strong national interest in maintaining stability and achieving a long-term peace in this part of the world. And Northeast Asia is an incredibly important region. 4 of the 6 world's largest militaries operate in the region. And with a very long history of conflict and occupations, they've got a collective memory that is just as long. And coupled with unresolved territorial disputes, many of the regional relationships are strained. A nuclear-armed North Korea with ICBM capability just adds more complexity to the situation. Any conflict in this region would send shockwaves around the world, and thus it's in our national interest to maintain stability and do our part to find a lasting peace here. You know, secondly, it's about building regional relationships. Our defense policy calls for greater engagement in the Asia-Pacific region, and Northeast Asia is the center of gravity of that part of the world. You know, as the slide shows, 1/5 of the world's economic output comes from the region and accounts for 19% of world trade and has 4 of the 12 of the world's largest economies. The region is important to us, and having a more persistent, noticeable presence will help build bilateral relationships with our regional partners. The Republic of Korea itself has become a dynamic, vibrant democracy since the end of the 1980s. As a key contributor to the Korean War, we have a vested interest to seeing this legacy of our sacrifice go forward and succeed. A visit to the UN cemetery in Busan, the only UN cemetery in the world, where right now 378, and in the next 12 hours, another one, 379 of our fallen lie buried. It really drives home the fact that we have put our blood into that soil. When our vets come over, they are very proud of what they see, and they see their sacrifice hasn't been in vain. It gives them meaning. On reflection, I'd like to think 50, 60 years from now, as we think back to our missions in other parts of the world, Middle East, will have the same sort of sentiment, but part of me kind of doubts that. Back to South Korea. We have increasingly strong trade ties with South Korea, so that relationship is important. And there's no doubt in the minds of South Korean leadership that Canada is engaged. Likewise with Japan, who recognize our contribution and are very thankful for it. They take a keen interest in what we're doing with United Nations Command, and I'm very happy to see that our relationship is increasingly stronger on other defense fronts. And the third and final reason for taking this position is quite simply the U.S. asked. Our bilateral relationship is a vital national interest. Now, despite our political ups and downs, the military-to-military relationship is strong. It's unwavering, and it needs to stay that way. So when the U.S. asked, our CDS, General Vance, he jumped on it. I guess he thought it was time to kick me out of the country again. So I'm going to talk a little bit about history here before I get into some specifics about United Nations Command, because it's very important to understand the history to give you context as to what we're doing now. So at the outset of the Korean War, a lot of discussion in the United Nations. A number of UN Security Council resolutions were passed. And it was number 84 that we refer to most often as our birth document. And in that Security Council resolution, the UN asked the U.S. to lead a unified command, to take command of forces that were being sent by member nations, and to fly the UN flag. And so that's the birth of United Nations Command. That document specifically talks about restoring peace and security to the area. And we quite often refer back to that document to give us daily guidance. So the war was prosecuted. 17 nations fought under that flag with combat forces, another 5 with medical forces. Fought it for 3 years, and then on the 27th of July, 1953, the armistice was signed after several years of hard negotiation. The armistice agreement established a number of commissions, 2 of which are still in existence: the Military Armistice Commission, which enforces the armistice, and a Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission, which monitors the armistice restrictions on the parties reinforcing or rearming themselves. So at the end of the war, United Nations Command was charged with enforcing that armistice on the southern side of the military demarcation line. At the same time being ready to step up and defend South Korea again if hostilities were to break out. 1957, U.S. Forces Korea was established as their national command element. And then, recognizing the growing proficiency of the military of the Republic of Korea, in 1978, Combined Forces Command was established as the warfighting command for the theater. Now, this is probably the most profound change for United Nations Command, as that role, that warfighting role, went from UNC to CFC. UNC retained the responsibility to enforce the armistice, but also to be the home for any sending state capabilities that would be sent in times of hostilities. What happened over the subsequent decades were many of the staffs of those 3 commands became intertwined, and some of them were wearing 2 or 3 hats. So by the time the 2010s came around, there was some confusion. On any given issue, on any given day, staff would be somewhat confused as to what command they were representing, what their legal foundations were, and really what their functions were with regards to the issue. So in 2014, then commander of the 3 commands, General Scaparrotti, made his intention known to revitalize United Nations Command. And he did this for a number of reasons. One, for the operational effectiveness and readiness of the three commands, he wanted to pull them apart and establish a proper supported relationship. Secondly, and probably more importantly, he realized there was untapped strategic potential in bringing back original sending state permanent staff to manifestly show the international community's support for what's going on. At the same time, there was a number of the original sending states, Canada included, that were looking to reinvest, looking to be part of a positive solution in the area. So you had this confluence of certain factors which led, culminating last summer, with United Nations Command being considered revitalized. And what I mean by that, it had a renewed vitality to it. It was very topical in the Korean media, and it was pushed to the forefront in many of the overtures or the trends towards peace that were happening last year. This was coupled with a move to Camp Humphreys, which is the largest U.S. base outside of the continental U.S. As the headquarters, USFK and United Nations Command were pulled out of Seoul an hour and 15, hour and 30 minutes south to this big, sprawling base. But that move itself gave the command additional vitality. So this leads us to the current day. And I want to talk a little bit about our current function. So you may not be able to read this at the back, but basically it discusses the three commands. All three of them being commanded by a single U.S. 4-star, and each one of them having a dedicated deputy commander, with a 4-star Korean as the deputy commander of Combined Forces Command, which, as I said, is the warfighting command. So its job is to defend South Korea. USFK as a dedicated, or as a U.S. 3-star as its deputy commander, and it is the national command element for on the U.S. side. And finally, UNC on the left is the command that is charged with enforcing the armistice agreement. So along with enforcing the armistice agreement, there's a number of responsibilities that come along with that. So we control everything that happens in the demilitarized zone. That 4-kilometer buffer zone established across the Korean Peninsula, 2 kilometers on each side of the military demarcation line. So everything south of that MDL is our responsibility. Now, from time to time, that will cause some questions from the ROC government, as there are questions about sovereignty with a foreign power, U.S. in this case, controlling that upper 2 kilometers. The other function that UNC takes on is enabling dialogue. We have the only dedicated communications with the North. Through our force in the Joint Security Area in Panmunjom, we have daily communication with the Korean People's Army. We also enable communications with the wider international community. So currently UNC sits at 17 sending states. We have monthly roundtables with all of those ambassadors. We use those to share information, to align messaging, and to help with any diplomatic messages that need to be sent. We maintain a status of forces agreement with Japan and a small detachment over in Tokyo that exercises that SOFA on a regular basis. And in fact, that SOFA is being used on a more frequent basis, as many of the sending states are involved in sanctions enforcement operations using bases out of Japan. And currently with Op Neon, our CP-140 detachment over there is based in Japan under the auspices of this SOFA. And the fourth thing that we're focused on during periods of armistice is readiness. Being ready to assume that role of being the home for sending states should conflict break out again. During crisis or hostilities, our role greatly changes. Now, we try to enforce the armistice to the greatest extent possible, but if crisis is going to break out, we quickly become the home for sending state capabilities that are sent to the theater. We handle all of those messy coalition warfare issues that a command would need to deal with, a multinational command would need to deal with, such as force integration. And what I mean by that is the negotiations for capabilities, the agreements that would need to be in place to bring those capabilities in, the command and control relationships that would be required to bring in multinational forces. We deal with the sustainment, understanding that if there was crisis or hostilities on the Korean Peninsula, there would be a huge non-combatant evacuation operation, so we help with the coordination of that. We help with strategic communications, aligning messages from the international community, and basically all of the other messy bits and pieces that coalition warfare entails. Now there's a supported relationship amongst these three commands, depending if we are in armistice or in hostilities. So in armistice, UNC is the supported command. Both CFC and USFK provide support as required, whether it's additional forces or the like. Once we switch to, or if we switch to hostilities, UNC becomes a supporting command to CFC as it leads the warfight. The chain of command, the C2 relationship, is very different for each of these commands as well. By virtue of United Nations Security Council Resolution 84, asking the U.S. government to be the executive agent for United Nations Command, we have a direct reporting relationship with the U.S. Joint Staff. So that's our higher headquarters. USFK, on the other hand, goes up through Indo-PACOM. And finally, CFC has a bilateral reporting relationship up through the two chairmans, through the ROC Ministry of Defense and the US SecDef to the two national leaders. Very similar to what we have with NORAD. So you can see the C2 can be a little bit confusing here as well. So that just gives you a bit of a background as to what the command is, what the command does. And I want to talk about the last 2 years and where we are today. The last 2 years really has been a roller coaster ride of very high tension, threats of war, and then followed by a trend towards peace and détente. In 2017, in the face of unprecedented nuclear and ballistic missile testing, war seemed very possible. Then, following the DPRK's last ballistic missile test on the 29th of November 2017, Kim Jong-un, or KJU for short, announced in his New Year's speech his intent to focus on economic development. And what followed was an unprecedented period of what we call summitry. Starting with the Olympics in February 2018, there was a continuous series of summits between the main players, all bilateral in nature. The highlights, of course, were the 3 inter-Korean summits and the 2 U.S.-North Korean ones. And I'd be remiss if I didn't announce that today is the 1-year anniversary of the first U.S.-North Korea summit. So given our responsibility for the south side of the demilitarized zone, UNC approves all crossings of the MDL. So anything from the south going north or anything from the north going south. A clear sign of the détente is the sheer number of crossings, or the difference in the number of crossings. In 2017, there were a total of 6, one of whom was a defector who crossed. Shortly after crossing, he got 5 bullet holes in him. In 2018, there were almost 18,000. So that one data point just shows you how things have changed over the period of 2 years. This period also saw the recommencement of much more interaction with the KPA at our level. After a 5-year hiatus, they actually started to answer when we conducted our twice-daily line checks, a practice that continues today. Our colonel level discussions were back on, again a first in a number of years. And probably the most tangible outcome of the first Trump-Kim summit was the return of 55 sets of remains. We were very heavily involved in this, with our United Nations Command Chief of Staff conducting the first North Korea UNC general officer level talk since 2009, and then him flying north to Wonsan to bring the remains back. And this is the furthest north a UNC general officer had gone since 1951. Having been at the repatriation ceremony, I can tell you it was an extremely powerful event. to see these flag-draped boxes with what we now know today to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 sets of individual remains. One of the 2018 events with the most impact on us was the signing of the Comprehensive Military Agreement that came out of the Third Inter-Korean Summit in September. Now, this agreement aimed to reduce tensions and demonstrate a tangible progress towards peace and better inter-Korean relations. Now, while there was much controversy in South Korean politics over the agreement, in UNC, after analyzing it, in fact, we contributed to its formation, but after analyzing the final product, we viewed it as an extension of the Armistice Agreement by virtue of the fact that it helps to reduce tension and avoid any unintended escalation. Now, most of the CMA's provisions were tactical in nature, covering such items as an extended no-fly zone, extending out from the demilitarized zone, removing a number of each side's guard posts, and the ones we focused on were the ones that were closest, some of them within a kilometer from each other, the North and Southern, or North Korean, South Korean guard posts. Shared use of the Han River estuary, demilitarization of the joint security area in Panmunjom. That's where we do much of our work. And joint demining and remains recovery in the Arrowhead Heights region, an area of the country that had seen some pretty significant fighting, especially in the ending days of the Korean War. So over the course of the last fall, we went through a pretty intense period of working to successfully implement this agreement. Throughout this time, we had some pretty good cooperation with the North, especially in terms of removing the guard posts, of starting demining efforts, joint demining efforts, both in the joint security area and up in the Arrowhead Heights area, and then demilitarizing the JSA. Then, it was almost like a light switch was turned off. Shortly after Christmas, in line with the wider stall in diplomacy, all that collaboration stopped. Now, while the KPA still answers our twice-daily line checks and accepts any messages that we pass, often there is no response. Joint efforts that were to begin on the 1st of April did not happen. So at the behest of the ROC government, we started some of these aspects unilaterally, such as remains recovery in the Arrowhead Heights. And I have to say this is the first remains recovery and demining in the demilitarized zone that has happened since the end of the war. In fact, just yesterday there was a repatriation ceremony of what they expect was the casualty identification agency found what they believed to be a U.S. soldier, and there was a ceremony up at that site to bring him back. We've also reopened tours in the joint security area, something that was supposed to be on both sides of the military demarcation line. But since the cooperation with the North had stopped, they were unilaterally done, reopened on the South again. So that's where we are with the implementation of this what was billed as a historic agreement, but we're not quite there yet. It's all tied to the wider impasse in diplomatic activity. So I've just talked about our efforts to achieve peace. I'm going to move to security now. Again, going back to our birth document, focusing on peace and security. The subject of combined exercises has been extremely topical, and one that you see continually attacked in North Korean rhetoric. Given the uncertainty of the situation, our readiness is critical. Just last Friday, I visited the Republic of Korea's Second Fleet and their emotion-evoking monument of the wreckage of the Chonan, a ROC ship that was attacked and sunk without warning by a North Korean submarine in 2010 with the loss of 46 sailors. Now, this speaks to the unpredictability of the regime. So the mindset of being able to fight tonight pervades, by necessity, everything that we do. And we don't have many postings where family members are issued gas masks. And as I look out of my office window daily and see a Patriot missile battery operationally deployed, focused on our defense, really drives home that fight tonight mentality. And we all know that a key component of readiness is training. and the need to exercise at all echelons is critical. At the same time, given the diplomatic situation, we've got to ensure that diplomacy has the necessary space to succeed. So I can tell you that combined exercises continue on the peninsula, but have been retooled to provide diplomacy that space, while at the same time ensuring our readiness. Now, 4 dials have been adjusted: the size, the scope, the timing, and the volume of these exercises. Theater-level command post exercises have been decoupled from large maneuver training. So you're not seeing the large influx of strategic assets like bombers and other forces come in while we do these theater rehearsal exercises. In past exercises, they were well broadcast in the media for their deterrent effect. We've turned the volume right down on that. Very little is said on them now, so there's not a heck of a lot of noise, despite North Korea continuing to complain about them. The fact of the matter is, though, for the last 4 seasons, the North Korean training cycle, their winter training cycle, has continued unabated. No change to size, scope, or number of participants. One of the key concerns that comes up from pundits off the peninsula is that readiness has been sacrificed to give diplomacy that space. But General Abrams, our commander, has been absolutely clear that training continues to be robust and intense, and the forces are ready should that call come to once again defend South Korea. I'll switch gears here and talk a little bit about challenges in doing a lot of this on the ground. The challenges we face in resolving this situation are many. And if it was easy, we wouldn't be stuck in this situation as we have been for the last 66 years. You know, I could go on at length on a range of these challenges, but I'll just talk about 3 interrelated ones, and we can dig into some others in Q&A as you wish. You know, first, there's a challenge in the diplomatic approach. And I believe at its root, the problem is one of there being a trust deficit. Nobody trusts North Korea to keep its word. Not the U.S., not most of South Korea, and not the wider international community. There's even doubts about Russia and China not trusting North Korea. Likewise, North Korea, the hermit kingdom, trusts no one. In fact, part of their regime's survival narrative is that they got to protect themselves against the outside world who would see them harm. Thus, they got to keep isolated and they got to keep armed. So what we're seeing happening now is 2 approaches to get to the same end: peace and an inherent part of that, North Korean denuclearization. The South Korean approach is to build relationships, which will lead to trust, which will lead to tangible outcomes. And that can almost be viewed as the Eastern approach. The U.S., or what could be viewed as the Western approach, is you got to see tangible actions first, i.e. some steps towards denuclearization, which will lead towards trust, which will lead to a better relationship. And so we've seen a collision or some friction in these 2 approaches. Now, I believe that answer is in the middle, but as with many things, the devil is in the detail as to which steps are acceptable at which times. So in the interim, North Korea seeks to drive a wedge between the 2. Indeed, this is part of their long-standing playbook. They are well practiced at exploiting differences amongst the actors in multilateral affairs, right from the get-go of the Korean War, where they played China and the Soviet Union off against each other. They are experts at this. The second challenge is KJU's intent, which is firstly to maintain his regime, normalize his possession of nukes, and develop the economy. You know, he continues to increase the size and lethality of his asymmetric arsenal, such as his weapons of mass destruction, not just nukes, but chemical and bio as well, his long-range artillery and missiles, his cyber capabilities, and his special operations forces. The reality, though, is the existential threat to North Korea is not military. It is one of ideas. To to speak metaphorically and to use this slide, it's about letting the light in. The images of a free and vibrant South Korea would show North Koreans what is possible for them, give them hope, and undermine the domestic legitimacy of the regime. So KJU faces a bit of a conundrum. How can he open up his economy enough while minimizing susceptibility to these ideas and keeping his grip on the population? Very complex for him as well. The third challenge that I'll mention, and a little bit closer to home for us, is the continued legitimacy of United Nations Command and the Armistice Agreement. North Korea and China both continue to attempt to erode it, labeling the Command and the Armistice Agreement a relic of the Cold War. Now, despite our daily communications, and despite the picture here showing our most recent trilateral colonels level negotiations, North Korea does its best to bypass United Nations Command. China, I believe, is fearful of the Command evolving into a NATO of Northeast Asia, as was discussed this morning, something focused against them. When I mentioned this in joking to some Japanese, in all seriousness, they thought it was a good idea. That being said, United Nations Command is the only security-focused multilateral organization in Northeast Asia, albeit one with some tremendous baggage, especially as it was party to the Korean War. On the Armistice Agreement, what was supposed to be a very military ceasefire document, or a very temporary one, to give time for a diplomatic political solution to be found, it's actually proven to be quite robust, as it's held up remarkably well for these past almost 66 years. It has been a key part, a key enabler in avoiding the resumption of hostilities. So I firmly believe that despite attempts to undermine it, it's got to stay in force until it's replaced by something better. And that something better is a peace treaty underpinned by a true peace regime. And what I mean by that are all the associated conflict resolution mechanisms that are in place and accepted by all parties. And that will take some doing. Because any transition to that, understanding that transition is the period of the most risk, well, we got to keep that in place until that something better is there. So I've covered a lot of ground here, and I could go on for hours more on other aspects of this very fascinating situation. But I want to give you some time for questions and take the conversation where you want to go. I'll wrap it up by saying that the situation remains uncertain. And on reflection, I guess you could say that that watchword, uncertainty, has been the same for the last 66 years. Since the end of the Cold War, when North Korea lost its primary communist benefactor, the Soviet Union, we've seen what some call 6 charm provocation cycles, with periods of tension ending with outreach, some diplomacy, and some hope, followed by renewed provocation and belligerence. Many tangible indicators show similarity this time around. So the pessimist would say this is nothing new, just the North Korea playbook in action. On the other hand, the optimist would say this time is different. And it's different because they say KJU is young. He's Western educated, who is educated in Switzerland. He's taken some time and he's consolidated his power base quite brutally with the execution of many of those around his father, or who had been around his father. He has his treasured sword, i.e. his nuclear deterrent that provides a credible deterrent and security for his regime. Sanctions are having an effect, albeit not a decisive effect, but an effect nonetheless. And you've got 2 presidents of the U.S. and the ROC that are willing to talk. So we don't know. We don't know if we follow the pessimist view or the optimist view. So we continue to watch many things with interest. KJU's next moves, the continuing impact of sanctions, the impact of the current drought in North Korea, and the actions of other regional actors. So it's been a fascinating time to be part of UNC, and I have been truly privileged to be part of this command and doing what I've been doing.